Two hands hit the floor of a burning starship. Severed at the wrist, still twitching, their owner kneels, disarmed, before a young man barely out of his 20s. Moments ago, this man terrified the galaxy. He faced down Yoda and walked away alive. He commanded armies that spanned 1,000 worlds. Now he is helpless, and the only question left is whether he dies in the next 10 seconds or the next 30. He does not die a villain in his own mind. That is the part almost no one understands. He dies believing he is still the hero of his own story. How does that happen? How does a Jedi Master, trained personally by the wisest being in the Order, mentor to some of the greatest Jedi who ever lived, end up kneeling in his own blood, waiting for an execution he helped make inevitable? The answer starts nowhere near a battlefield. It starts with an infant, carried away from his family before he was old enough to remember his own mother's face, and a quiet, decades-long transformation that no one around him, not even the man himself, ever saw coming until it was far, far too late. This is the entire story of Count Dooku, Jedi Master, revolutionary, and Sith Lord, told from the very beginning. Dooku was born into the House of Sereno, one of the oldest and most distinguished noble families in the galaxy, rulers of a green and prosperous world in the Outer Rim territories. His father, Count Gora, presided over vast estates and a legacy stretching back countless generations. Wealth was never a question for the family. Power, prestige, and old blood ran through Sereno's court like a second nervous system. But Dooku himself was one of at least 2 children. And, unlike his elder sister, Genza, who would remain on Sereno to one day inherit the family's title, young Dooku was found to be extraordinarily strong in the Force. Genza was older by several years, old enough to remember her younger brother as an infant, old enough to remember the day the Jedi came to Sereno's palace to evaluate him. Dooku himself would never have any memory of that day, nor of his mother's face, nor of the halls he was carried through as a newborn. He would spend the rest of his life reconstructing his own origins secondhand, through court records, through the occasional letter, through fragments of a childhood that belonged to him by blood, but not by memory. When Jedi talent scouts detected an extraordinary Force sensitivity in the boy, his family made the choice that so many families across the galaxy made when confronted with a Force-sensitive child, especially one born into a house with a title and lands that already had a clear heir waiting in the wings. They gave him up. It was not, by the standards of Sereno's nobility, considered a tragedy. It was considered an honor, a chance for a second son to serve the wider galaxy in a role no ordinary nobleman could ever hold. Whether infant Dooku experienced it as an honor or as an abandonment is a question no record can answer. But the shape of the rest of his life suggests that some part of him, buried beneath decades of Jedi discipline, never stopped asking it. Dooku was still an infant, barely past his earliest years, when he was taken from Sereno and brought to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, a towering monument of spires and quiet halls that would become the only home he could consciously remember. It is worth sitting with what that must have meant for a child born into privilege, comfort, and a family name that opened every door in known space. From the moment he arrived at the temple, Dooku was expected to let go of all of it. The Jedi Order did not recognize titles. It did not recognize inherited wealth or noble blood. Within those Durasteel walls, a count's son was simply another youngling, sorted into a clan, given a simple tunic, and taught that attachment, even to one's own family name, was a road towards suffering. For most children, this adjustment was difficult but manageable, softened by the camaraderie of clanmates and the guidance of kind instructors. For Dooku, something about the transition seems to have left a permanent mark. Even as a child, instructors and fellow younglings noted a certain reserve in him, a coolness that set him apart from his peers. He was polite, disciplined, and extraordinarily capable, but rarely warm. Some who trained alongside him would later say that Dooku never fully surrendered the bearing of a nobleman, that some quiet part of him always remembered, even if he could not recall the details, that he had been born to command rather than to obey. What made this reserve more than a simple personality quirk was the discovery of an old family legend, one that would follow Dooku through the whispers of the temple halls for years. Generations before his birth, a member of House Sereno was said to have flirted with the dark side of the Force, dabbling in Sith teachings, before ultimately renouncing them. Some accounts held that a supposed curse had settled over the bloodline afterward, a shadow that periodically resurfaced in descendants who displayed unusual aptitude for the darker aspects of the Force. Whether this was superstition, distorted history, or genuine premonition, it became a story that other younglings occasionally used to tease or unsettle the young count's son. Dooku, proud even as a child, did not appreciate being reduced to a family ghost story. He worked twice as hard to prove that whatever shadow supposedly lingered over his bloodline, he was its master and not the reverse. It is a grim irony, in hindsight, that decades of discipline meant to disprove a curse would end with Dooku fulfilling it more completely than any of his ancestors ever had. Despite his emotional distance, or perhaps because of it, Dooku excelled. He proved to be extraordinarily gifted with a lightsaber, showing an early talent for precision and control that outpaced many of his older clanmates. He absorbed lessons in Jedi philosophy, history, and diplomacy with the same discipline he brought to his physical training. And by the time he reached the age when younglings are selected as Padawan learners, his reputation within the temple had already begun to grow. It was not simply that Dooku was talented, it was that he seemed to carry himself with an assurance most younglings had not yet earned. An early glimpse of the commanding presence that would later make him one of the most respected voices in the Jedi Order, and one of the most dangerous separatist leaders the Republic ever faced. The Jedi who ultimately selected Dooku as a Padawan was not simply any master, but Grand Master Yoda himself, one of the most revered and ancient members of the Jedi Council. To be chosen by Yoda was an extraordinary honor, a signal that the Order's most senior teacher saw exceptional potential in the young initiate. Under Yoda's tutelage, Dooku received an education unlike almost any other Jedi of his generation, steeped not only in lightsaber technique, but in the deeper philosophical currents that Yoda himself had spent centuries exploring. It was during this apprenticeship that Dooku began to develop the fighting style that would define him for the rest of his life, a refined and economical form of lightsaber combat that favored elegant precision over brute force. In time, he would become one of the greatest practitioners the galaxy had ever seen of this dueling philosophy, a style built around control, patience, and surgical decisiveness rather than raw aggression. Where some Jedi fought like storms, Dooku fought like a scalpel, and that distinction would come to define both his triumphs and his eventual fall. Yoda's guidance shaped more than Dooku's swordsmanship. The Old Master was known throughout the Order for his patience, his humility, and his deep suspicion of pride. Qualities he worked tirelessly to instill in his aristocratic apprentice. For a time, it seemed to work. Dooku matured into a Padawan renowned for both his skill and his devotion to Jedi principles. Someone who could hold his own in philosophical debate as easily as he could in a sparring ring. But even those who admired him most could sense an undercurrent of restlessness in the young Padawan, a growing frustration with what he increasingly viewed as the Order's caution, its reluctance to take decisive action even when decisive action seemed obviously necessary. Yoda, wise as he was, recognized this tension in his apprentice. He counseled Dooku repeatedly on the dangers of impatience and the necessity of trusting the slow, deliberate wisdom of the Jedi Council. Lessons that Dooku absorbed intellectually, even as something in his temperament continued to chafe against them. There is a story, told quietly among Jedi, who trained in that era, of a mission Yoda and his Padawan undertook to a border world, caught in a brutal territorial dispute between two rival clans. The local conflict had dragged on for years, claiming the lives of soldiers and civilians alike, and the Jedi Council had sent Yoda to mediate a lasting peace. Young Dooku, still a Padawan at the time, grew visibly frustrated as negotiations stretched from days into weeks, as both sides repeatedly reneged on tentative agreements, as Yoda calmly returned to the table again and again without any apparent loss of patience. Dooku suggested, at one point, that a more forceful demonstration of Jedi capability might shorten the negotiations considerably, that fear could accomplish what diplomacy alone seemed unable to. Yoda's response was gentle but unmistakably firm. Peace bought with fear, he told his apprentice, was not peace at all, merely violence deferred to a later date. The two clans would eventually reach a genuine accord, one that endured for decades after the Jedi departed, and Yoda would cite the outcome for years afterward as proof that patience, however maddening, produced results that force could never replicate. Dooku accepted the lesson outwardly. Privately, something in him remained unconvinced, a seed of doubt about whether such patience could truly scale to threats greater than a single border dispute. It was also during these Padawan years that Dooku's mastery of lightsaber combat began to draw wider attention across the Order. His chosen style, built around economy of motion and surgical precision, stood in sharp, visual contrast to the more physically demanding forms favored by many of his contemporaries. Where other duelists relied on speed, power, and relentless aggression, Dooku learned to win through anticipation, redirecting an opponent's momentum and closing the distance only when a decisive strike was assured. Sparring instructors began pairing him against increasingly senior students specifically to test how his refined technique held up against raw strength and experience. And more often than not, Dooku emerged from these bouts victorious, disarming opponents, twice his age, with an economy of movement that left onlookers quietly unsettled. It was elegant. It was also, even then, faintly cold, a style that some observers noted seemed to value control over connection, victory over camaraderie, a duelist who fought to end an encounter as efficiently as possible rather than to test himself against a worthy opponent for its own sake. When Dooku was finally knighted, he emerged as one of the most formidable Jedi of his generation, celebrated across the Order for his mastery of the blade and his considerable diplomatic skill. He was, by every outward measure, a model of what the Jedi aspired to produce. He served the Republic loyally on countless missions, resolving conflicts, negotiating peace between warring factions, and demonstrating time and again that his aristocratic bearing could be turned into an asset in the halls of galactic diplomacy rather than a liability. Dooku possessed the rare gift of being taken seriously by senators, monarchs, and crime lords alike, a Jedi who could walk into a royal court and command respect without saying a word. He carried himself into royal courts not as a supplicant but as an equal, and monarchs who had grown accustomed to treating Jedi envoys as useful but ultimately subordinate functionaries of the Republic found themselves almost without meaning to. Extending Dooku the kind of deference normally reserved for visiting heads of state. Crime lords, too, responded to him differently than they responded to most Jedi. Where they might dismiss a younger, more idealistic knight as naive, they recognized in Dooku someone who understood the mechanics of power and leverage as intimately as they did themselves. Someone who could not be easily flattered, threatened, or outmaneuvered in a negotiation. This talent made him invaluable to the Order, and it also fed something within him that would prove, over decades, to be his undoing. He grew accustomed to being the most capable person in almost every room he entered, and that expectation would eventually curdle into something far more dangerous than simple confidence. As a Jedi Knight and later a Jedi Master, Dooku took on Padawans of his own, continuing the cycle of teaching that had shaped him under Yoda. Among his earliest apprentices was Rael Averross, a headstrong and unconventional young man whose looser interpretation of Jedi discipline stood in sharp contrast to Dooku's own exacting standards. Despite their differences in temperament, or perhaps because of them, Dooku and Averross developed a bond built on mutual respect, and Averross would go on to become a skilled Jedi Knight in his own right, eventually taking on responsibilities that kept him far from Coruscant for years at a stretch. During his apprenticeship, Averross frequently found himself on the receiving end of Dooku's exacting standards, corrected for imprecision in his footwork, for sloppiness in his reports, for a tendency to rely on charm where careful preparation would have served him better. Yet even as Averross bristled at his master's severity, he came to recognize that Dooku's corrections were never cruel for their own sake. They were the corrections of a man who genuinely believed that excellence was owed, both to oneself and to the people a Jedi was sworn to protect, and who could not understand why anyone would settle for less when more was so plainly possible. It was a philosophy that produced remarkable results in his students, and one that, decades later, would curdle into something far less forgiving, once turned toward an entire galaxy rather than a single apprentice. Dooku's reputation as a diplomat grew alongside his reputation as a swordsman, and among the missions that cemented his standing across the Republic was a lengthy negotiation on a contested border world where two neighboring systems had spent nearly a generation locked in an increasingly bloody resource dispute. Previous Jedi envoys had made little headway, and by the time Dooku arrived, both sides approached the negotiating table with open contempt for the process itself, convinced that further talks were merely a formality before renewed fighting. Dooku spent weeks not at the negotiating table but in the field, touring devastated settlements, speaking directly with soldiers and refugees, rather than only their leaders, compiling a detailed account of the human cost of the conflict that he then presented unflinchingly to both delegations. It was a tactic few Jedi diplomats employed so directly, forcing negotiators to confront consequences they had grown adept at abstracting away in council chambers. The resulting treaty held for decades, and the mission became something of a case study within the Order for how a Jedi's presence could reshape a negotiation through sheer force of documented truth rather than mediation alone. It was, in many ways, Dooku at his very best, wielding his considerable intellect and gravitas in service of a peace that actually held, rather than one that merely looked good on a Senate record. Dooku's approach to teaching was demanding but not unkind. He pushed his students hard, expected excellence, and rarely offered praise freely. But those who trained under him consistently described a mentor who genuinely cared about their growth, even if he struggled to express that care in conventional terms. It was during these years that Dooku formed one of the most consequential friendships of his life, a bond with a fellow Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas. The two men shared something rare within the Order, a willingness to question its institutional caution openly, to wonder aloud whether the Jedi's traditional patience was truly wisdom or simply a comfortable excuse for inaction in the face of growing galactic corruption. Sifo Dyas, like Dooku, possessed a gift for foresight and a growing unease about the direction the Republic was heading. Their late-night conversations, philosophical and increasingly political, planted seeds in Dooku's mind that would not fully bloom for many years, but which never entirely left him. Long before Dooku ever donned the mantle of a Sith Lord, he was already a Jedi who privately doubted whether the Order he served was equipped to handle the crisis he sensed approaching. That doubt, nurtured across years of friendship with Sifo Dyas, would eventually become one of the cracks through which the dark side found its way in. Perhaps the most significant relationship of Dooku's Jedi life, however, was his apprenticeship of a young man named Qui-Gon Jinn. When the boy was selected as Dooku's Padawan at the age of 12, he arrived terrified, not of his new master's stern reputation, but of his own fear of failure. Dooku, in one of the more telling moments of his character during this period, did not punish or dismiss that fear. Instead, he drew it out of his young apprentice with careful questioning, ultimately praising Qui-Gon's honesty rather than criticizing his nervousness, noting that most Padawans simply buried such feelings rather than confronting them. It was an early glimpse of a Dooku capable of genuine warmth, a side of him that rarely surfaced but was clearly present beneath the composed exterior. Over the years that followed, master and apprentice developed a deep, complicated bond built on mutual respect and, at times, mutual frustration. Qui-Gon possessed an independent streak that echoed Dooku's own youthful restlessness, and their relationship was defined as much by philosophical disagreement as by affection. Early in their partnership, Dooku gave his new apprentice a comprehensive tour of the Jedi Temple, showing the boy the sparring dojos, the Great Assembly Hall, the sprawling archives where the Order kept its accumulated knowledge. In those archives, something caught young Qui-Gon's eye, an ancient holocron, unlike the others surrounding it. When he asked about it, Dooku's expression darkened noticeably. It contained ancient Jedi prophecies, he explained, the kind of mystic knowledge that had a long history of leading those who studied it too deeply toward ruin. The order no longer encouraged its members to dwell on such texts, he told his apprentice, and Qui-Gon should be wary of doing so himself. It was sound advice, the kind any responsible master might offer a curious Padawan. It was also, as Qui-Gon would later learn from another of Dooku's former students, deeply hypocritical. Dooku himself had once been consumed by those very prophecies, spending long nights in the archives poring over cryptic visions of balance and chosen ones, until some unrecorded turning point, had caused him to abandon that obsession as abruptly as he now warned his own apprentice away from it. What exactly changed his mind, and why, remains one of the quieter mysteries of Dooku's Jedi years, though in hindsight it reads as an early sign of a man capable of setting aside conviction, only to have it resurface, transformed, decades later. Dooku also had a brother, a fact that surprised Qui-Gon considerably when the two of them, invited to a diplomatic air rally on Coruscant, encountered a competing pilot named Ramil among the racers. The reunion was strained. Whatever had happened between the two Sereno brothers in the years since Dooku's departure for the Jedi Temple had left a distance, neither seemed eager to bridge, and Qui-Gon watched with quiet fascination as his composed, unflappable master navigated a conversation heavier with unspoken history than any negotiation he had witnessed Dooku conduct with a foreign government. When Ramil's speeder was later sabotaged during the race, the two Jedi uncovered a cover-up implicating the very officials meant to be investigating the incident, and Dooku's fury at the corruption they exposed burned with an intensity that startled even Qui-Gon, who had never seen his master's composure crack so visibly outside a lightsaber duel. It was one more thread in a pattern young Qui-Gon was only beginning to notice, an accumulating catalogue of moments where his master's Jedi serenity gave way, briefly but unmistakably, to something closer to rage. Their partnership endured through numerous dangerous missions, including a harrowing operation on the planet Galadron that would leave permanent scars on both men, though in very different ways. Dooku had taken on a second apprentice by this point, a young woman named Komarivosa, whose talent matched her volatility. The mission to Galadron was meant to be straightforward, a request from the local governor to help suppress what he described as a dangerous band of Mandalorian mercenaries terrorizing the planet's population. In truth, the governor had deceived the Jedi entirely. The so-called mercenaries were actual Mandalorian warriors operating under a legitimate contract, unaware that the conflict had been manufactured to draw Jedi blood. The governor's own private security forces joined the battle alongside his soldiers, disguised in a manner meant to implicate the Mandalorians further. And by the time the true nature of the ambush became clear, the fighting had already spiraled into chaos across the planet's rain-soaked fields. Jedi who had arrived, expecting a straightforward peacekeeping operation, found themselves cut down by blaster fire from positions they had believed to be friendly, their formations broken, their communications jammed. When the ambush unfolded in full, dozens of Jedi were killed in the ensuing battle, a staggering loss for an order that rarely suffered casualties on such a scale in a single engagement. Dooku himself, along with his apprentices, fought his way through the wreckage of the operation, cutting a path through both the deception and the droids and soldiers thrown against them, and by the mission's end he had personally confronted and defeated Jango Fett, the Mandalorian leader whose warriors, ironically, had themselves been deceived into becoming the instruments of so many Jedi deaths. Dooku spared Fett's life in the aftermath, a decision that would echo forward in ways neither man could have anticipated, as Fett's genetic template would one day become the foundation of an entire clone army, one that Dooku himself would later help commission in secret. The aftermath of Galidron proved just as consequential as the battle itself. Devastated and humiliated by the scale of the tragedy, Vosa struggled to reconcile what had happened with the ideals she had been taught to uphold. In the years that followed, her connection to the Jedi Order frayed until it broke entirely. In the immediate aftermath, Dooku tried repeatedly to reach her, to counsel her through the trauma of the battle in the same measured way he had once counseled Qui-Gon through his early fears. But where Qui-Gon had responded to honesty with growth, Vosa responded to the horrors of Galidron with a slow, corrosive bitterness that no amount of counsel seemed able to reach. She grew distant from her fellow Jedi, then distant from the Order's teachings entirely, until finally she abandoned her training altogether. What followed was a steep and public descent, one that would have been unthinkable for a Jedi trained under one of the Order's most respected masters. Vosa drifted first into smuggling, then into outright criminal enterprise, eventually rising through the ranks of the galaxy's underworld until she claimed leadership of a powerful bounty hunters guild, commanding hardened killers and mercenaries with the same discipline she had once been taught to bring to lightsaber forms. For Dooku, her fall was one of the more painful losses of his teaching career, a visible, undeniable proof that even his most rigorous training could not always outrun the wounds a person carried with them. For Dooku himself, Galidron became a formative example of everything he believed was wrong with the way the Republic and the Jedi Order operated. A corrupt official had lied to the Order, manipulated its members into fighting an unnecessary and bloody battle, and faced no meaningful consequences for the dozens of lives lost as a result. To Dooku, incidents like this were not isolated failures. They were symptoms of a much deeper rot, one that the Jedi Council seemed unwilling or unable to confront directly. Where his colleagues saw a tragedy to mourn and move past, Dooku increasingly saw a system in need of fundamental change. Qui-Gon, for his part, continued to grow under Dooku's guidance, eventually reaching the rank of Jedi Knight and stepping out from his master's shadow to walk his own distinctive path within the Order. He developed a reputation for a maverick streak that occasionally put him at odds with the Jedi Council, an independence of thought that mirrored, in gentler form, the very qualities that were beginning to isolate Dooku from his peers. The two men remained close even after Qui-Gon's knighting, their bond tested but never broken by disagreements over philosophy or method. On several occasions, their paths crossed again on joint missions, moments that revealed both the depth of their connection and the widening gap between their worldviews. During one such mission, Qui-Gon witnessed his former master unleash Force lightning against a dangerous opponent, a power long associated with the dark side rather than the light. It unsettled him deeply, though Dooku brushed off the concern, framing it as a pragmatic tool rather than evidence of any deeper corruption. Small moments like these, easy to dismiss individually, would later be remembered by those who knew Dooku as early warning signs of a path that had already begun to bend, long before anyone dared call it a fall. As the years passed, Dooku's standing within the Jedi Order continued to rise. He was widely regarded as one of the most capable and respected Jedi Masters of his generation, a status recognized by his eventual invitation to join the Jedi Council itself, the governing body responsible for guiding the entire Order. It was, by any measure, the pinnacle of a Jedi's career, an acknowledgement from his peers that his wisdom and skill merited a seat among the Order's most trusted leaders. And yet, Dooku's relationship with the Council remained complicated even after he accepted this honor. He continued to voice sharp criticisms of Republic governance, of Senate corruption, of what he saw as the growing chasm between the ideals the Jedi claimed to serve and the compromised reality of galactic politics. His fellow council members respected his intellect even as they grew increasingly wary of his rhetoric, sensing in him a dissatisfaction that ran deeper than ordinary political frustration. Yoda, more attuned to his former apprentice than perhaps anyone else on the council, noticed this shift as well, and on more than one occasion sought Dooku out privately after a contentious session to speak with him, not as a fellow council member, but as the master who had once shaped his earliest understanding of the Force. These conversations were gentler than the formal debates that provoked them. And Dooku, even at his most disillusioned, never lost his genuine respect for the diminutive master who had trained him. Yet even Yoda's careful, patient counsel could not fully close the distance that had opened between Dooku's convictions and the Order's official positions. Yoda would later reflect, long after Dooku's true allegiance had been revealed, that he had sensed a troubling darkness gathering around his former apprentice during these very years, a darkness he had mistaken for ordinary frustration rather than the early signs of something far more dangerous taking root. It was, by Yoda's own admission, one of the greatest failures of perception in his exceptionally long life, a failure made all the more painful by how close he had once been to the man who would ultimately hide his transformation from him so completely. Dooku, for his part, grew equally wary of a council he viewed as too comfortable, too willing to maintain appearances, rather than confront the Republic's decay directly. During one particularly heated council session, Dooku argued forcefully that the Order should take a more active role in rooting out corruption among sector governors and planetary administrators, rather than waiting to be summoned only after a crisis had already claimed lives, as had happened on Galidron. Several of his fellow council members pushed back firmly, reminding him that the Jedi served the Republic's government rather than supplanting it, that overstepping their mandate risked transforming peacekeepers into an occupying force feared rather than trusted across the galaxy. Dooku countered that a peacekeeping force too cautious to prevent tragedy was, in practice, indistinguishable from one that simply did not exist, a remark that drew visible discomfort from several masters in the chamber. Yoda, present for the exchange, offered no immediate rebuke, but the old master's silence in that moment stayed with Dooku long afterward, a silence he would later choose to interpret as tacit agreement rather than the thoughtful restraint it more likely represented. It was a small misreading, barely worth noting at the time. In hindsight, it reads as one of many moments where Dooku's certainty in his own judgment quietly outpaced his willingness to sit with genuine uncertainty, a trait that would serve him poorly once far more dangerous voices began offering him validation instead of caution. Other council members present that day would later recall the exchange, with a kind of retrospective unease, wondering aloud whether they should have pressed harder, argued longer, refused to let the matter rest so easily. None of them could have known, in that ordinary chamber on an ordinary day, that they were witnessing the earliest visible cracks in a fracture that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy. It was during this period of mounting disillusionment that Dooku's closest friendship took an unexpected and troubling turn. Sifo Dyas, still consumed by his visions of a coming galactic war, began to act increasingly on his own initiative, convinced that the Republic would soon need a military force it did not yet possess. Dooku listened to his friend's warnings with a mixture of sympathy and concern, understanding all too well the frustration that came from watching a looming crisis dismissed by a complacent bureaucracy. But even Dooku, cynical as he had become about the Order's caution, could not have anticipated just how far Sifo Dyas would go to act on his convictions, nor the shadowy figures who would ultimately exploit his friend's desperation for their own purposes. In their final conversations, Sifo Dyas spoke to Dooku of visions he had experienced through the Force, fragmented glimpses of a galaxy engulfed in war, of Jedi fighting alongside soldiers they did not yet possess, of a conflict so vast that the Republic's traditional reliance on scattered sector militias would prove catastrophically inadequate. He had already, without Council authorization, begun making inquiries about a massive army, one that could be grown rather than recruited, trained rather than conscripted, ready the moment the crisis he foresaw finally arrived. Dooku listened to these plans with genuine alarm, warning his friend that acting so far outside the Order's sanction was a dangerous and potentially reckless path, whatever the sincerity of his visions. Sifo Dyas, increasingly convinced that time was running out and that the Council's caution would doom the very people he was trying to protect, pressed forward regardless. Not long after, he vanished from the public record entirely, his fate shrouded in mystery for years, his disappearance quietly noted and then largely forgotten by an Order consumed with more immediate concerns. Dooku searched quietly for answers about his friend's fate for a time, through old contacts and discreet inquiries, but found nothing beyond dead ends and official indifference. One more instance, in his eyes, of a Republic and an Order too preoccupied with their own procedures to properly account for the disappearance of one of their most capable members. For Dooku, the loss of his closest confidant was a wound that never fully healed, one more entry in a growing ledger of grievances against a galaxy that seemed, in his eyes, endlessly willing to let good people suffer for the failures of corrupt institutions. The crisis that claimed Qui-Gon's life had begun, from the Order's perspective, as a fairly ordinary diplomatic dispute, a trade blockade imposed against the small, peaceful world of Naboo by a powerful commercial federation unhappy with new Republic taxation policies on trade routes through the outer systems. Qui-Gon and his own Padawan had been dispatched to negotiate a resolution, a mission that should have ended in tense but unremarkable compromise. Instead, they found themselves fleeing an invasion fleet, uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Trade Federation's leadership, and ultimately crossing paths with a queen determined to reclaim her occupied homeworld by any means necessary. None of that, on its own, would have shaken the Jedi Order to its foundations. What did was the warrior who confronted Qui-Gon and his apprentice as they escorted the Queen's forces toward the royal palace. A figure cloaked in black, wielding a blade with two humming crimson edges, radiating a presence in the Force that every Jedi present recognized immediately as something the Order had not encountered in 1,000 years. Then came the loss that would ultimately break whatever remained of Dooku's faith in the Jedi path entirely. His former apprentice, Qui-Gon Jinn, was killed in a lightsaber duel on the planet Naboo, cut down by a mysterious warrior wielding a double-bladed weapon and radiating a darkness the Jedi had not encountered in a millennium. The death of Qui-Gon sent shockwaves through the Order, not simply because a talented Jedi Knight had fallen, but because his killer represented proof that the Sith, long believed extinct, had somehow survived in secret for 1,000 years without detection. For Dooku, the grief was profound and deeply personal. Qui-Gon had been more than a former apprentice. He had been, in many ways, the closest thing to a son Dooku had ever allowed himself to have. A living connection to the version of himself that still believed unreservedly in the Jedi cause. Dooku did not attend the public memorial held at the Jedi Temple, a decision that struck several of his former colleagues as uncharacteristically withdrawn for a man who had always understood the diplomatic value of appearances. Instead, by the accounts of the few who saw him during those weeks, he retreated to Sereno for a private period of mourning, spending long hours alone in halls that had once belonged to his ancestors, grieving in a manner far more personal than anything he had permitted himself during his decades inside the Jedi Order. Some who knew him during this period would later say that the loss of Qui-Gon seemed to hollow something out of Dooku permanently, that the version of him who returned to public life afterward carried himself with a colder, more calculating edge than before, as though grief itself had been filed down into something sharper and more useful. His death crystallized every doubt that had been quietly accumulating in Dooku's mind for decades. If the Jedi Order, with all its vaunted wisdom and centuries of vigilance, could fail to notice the Sith's return until they were standing in the middle of a royal palace on Naboo, what confidence could anyone have in its ability to protect the galaxy from the dangers Dooku increasingly believed were gathering just beyond the Republic's complacent gaze? In the months that followed Qui-Gon's death, Dooku withdrew further from the council he had once been honored to join. He continued to serve, outwardly at least, but colleagues noted a growing coldness in his demeanor, a sense that some fundamental commitment had quietly dissolved within him, even as he continued to wear the robes of a Jedi Master. He had spent his entire life since infancy inside an institution that preached patience, humility, and faith in a slow, deliberate process of galactic stewardship, and yet everywhere he looked, Dooku now saw only the fruits of that patience. A Senate paralyzed by corruption, a Republic bureaucracy more concerned with procedure than justice, an order that mourned its losses eloquently, but rarely acted to prevent the conditions that caused them. The final break, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its quietness. There was no dramatic confrontation with the Council, no public renunciation of Jedi teachings. Dooku simply resigned, informing his fellow council members that he could no longer, in good conscience, continue to serve an order and a republic he had come to believe were beyond meaningful repair. His departure stunned the Jedi Order. Few members carried the prestige, the accomplishment, or the sheer institutional respect that Dooku had earned over decades of service, and his resignation was treated by many as a genuine loss rather than a betrayal, at least in its earliest days. Dooku returned to Sereno for the first time in what felt like several lifetimes, reclaiming the noble title and vast estates he had left behind as an infant. The Count, who had once been a nameless youngling in the Jedi Temple, now stood once more in the halls of his ancestors. Wealthy beyond measure, free of the restrictions the Jedi Code had placed upon him for the whole of his adult life. To the wider galaxy, this transformation appeared to be little more than a Jedi Master choosing, later in life, to embrace the birthright he had long ago set aside. In truth, it was the opening move of something far more dangerous, though almost no one, not even those who knew him best, understood that yet. Freed from the constraints of the Jedi Code, Dooku began to speak more openly and more forcefully about the failures he perceived in the Republic. He used his renewed wealth and status to travel across the galaxy, meeting with disillusioned senators, frustrated planetary leaders, and entire star systems that felt abandoned by a Coruscant government mired in gridlock and corporate influence. His message resonated widely because it was not, at its core, a lie. The corruption Dooku described was real. The Senate's dysfunction was real. The suffering of countless worlds left to fend for themselves while galactic politicians debated procedural minutiae was entirely real, and Dooku's willingness to name these failures plainly, without the diplomatic hedging so common among career politicians, earned him a growing following among those who felt the Republic no longer represented them. He positioned himself not as a villain seeking power, but as a reformer, a voice for star systems that had lost faith in Coruscant's ability or willingness to govern them fairly. His tour took him to worlds the Senate had all but forgotten. Mining colonies bled dry by Republic taxation, without corresponding investment. Agricultural systems left to negotiate trade terms directly with predatory corporate conglomerates. Because no Senate representative had visited in a generation, border territories left almost entirely undefended against pirate raids, while Coruscant debated procedural amendments in climate-controlled chambers thousands of light years away. Dooku listened to local leaders describe these grievances with the same careful attention he had once brought to Jedi negotiations. And where he had once used that attention to broker compromise on behalf of the Republic, he now used it to build a case against the Republic itself. He met with planetary governors frustrated by endless bureaucratic delay, with guild representatives furious at taxation policies that favored core world interests, with entire sectors that had quietly begun exploring self-governance simply because Coruscant no longer seemed capable of governing them at all. Each conversation added another thread to the narrative Dooku was constructing, and slowly, deliberately, those threads began to weave themselves into the framework of an organized political movement. What none of Dooku's new allies could have known was that his path back into galactic politics had not been a solitary journey. During his travels in the wake of Qui-Gon's death, Dooku had encountered a figure of extraordinary charisma and apparent insight, a man who seemed to understand precisely the frustrations gnawing at Dooku's conscience, who spoke the language of reform and justice with a fluency that mirrored Dooku's own private convictions. This figure was, in reality, a Sith Lord of immense patience and cunning, one who had spent decades constructing an elaborate political facade while secretly orchestrating the very decay that men like Dooku found so intolerable. Recognizing in the disillusioned former Jedi Master both extraordinary talent and a wound deep enough to exploit, this Sith Lord began a careful, methodical seduction, one built not on promises of raw power, but on the far more persuasive currency of validation. Dooku was told In essence, that he had been right all along, that the Jedi were blind, that the Republic was beyond saving through conventional means, that true change required someone willing to make the hard choices the Council had always been too timid to consider. Their first meeting took place under circumstances Dooku would later remember as entirely unremarkable, a chance introduction at a gathering of political dissidents on a mid-rim world, arranged by intermediaries who never revealed the true architect behind the invitation. The stranger who approached him that evening asked careful, probing questions about Dooku's departure from the Order, questions that seemed less like idle curiosity and more like a physician taking the measure of a wound before deciding how to treat it. Over the following months, their conversations continued. First, through discreet correspondence, and later through occasional private meetings, arranged with meticulous care to avoid detection. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Dooku would voice a grievance, some fresh example of Republic dysfunction or Jedi complacency he had encountered in his travels, and his new confidant would receive it not with the polite deflection Dooku had grown accustomed to from his former council colleagues, but with genuine, validating agreement, often accompanied by additional evidence of corruption Dooku himself had not yet uncovered. It was, in retrospect, a masterclass in manipulation, though at the time it simply felt to Dooku like the rare experience of finally being heard. Only gradually did the nature of these meetings begin to shift from political commiseration towards something more explicitly esoteric. His new mentor began speaking of the Force in terms Dooku had never encountered during his Jedi training, framing the discipline and self-denial the Order demanded not as wisdom but as a form of self-imposed limitation, a philosophy designed to keep extraordinary individuals from ever realizing the full scope of their own potential. Where the Jedi taught that peace required patience, his teachings reframed patience as an excuse for inaction. Where the Jedi taught that attachment led to suffering, his teachings suggested that the Jedi's fear of attachment was itself a kind of cowardice, a refusal to feel deeply enough to act decisively when action was required. Dooku, still carrying the raw grief of Qui-Gon's death and the accumulated frustration of decades spent watching preventable tragedies unfold, found these arguments disturbingly persuasive. It is a testament to the sophistication of this manipulation that Dooku, a man renowned throughout the galaxy for his intellect and his skepticism, walked willingly into what was, in truth, an elaborate trap, decades in the making. He began training in secret, learning the ways of the dark side of the Force under the tutelage of his new master, absorbing lessons that built directly upon the very grievances that had driven him from the Jedi Order in the first place. Where the Jedi taught patience, his new teachings framed decisive, ruthless action as strength rather than danger. Where the Jedi taught humility, he was told that his exceptional gifts entitled him to reshape galactic events rather than merely observe them. Piece by piece, the philosophy that had once made Dooku one of the most respected Jedi of his generation was inverted, repurposed, and redirected toward an entirely different end. He took the name Darth Tyrannus, a new identity built atop the foundation of everything he had once been, and began the long, patient work of transforming his very real political grievances into the opening moves of a war that would ultimately consume the galaxy he claimed he wanted to save. The training itself was conducted in near total secrecy, in locations far from the prying eyes of any Jedi who might sense a disturbance in the Force, on Dooku's own private estates, aboard unmarked vessels, in the kind of remote and forgotten corners of the galaxy that a lifetime of Jedi missions had taught him how to find. He learned to mask his presence in the Force with the same discipline he had once applied to lightsaber forms, layering shields within shields until even Master Yoda, a man who had once known him more intimately than almost anyone alive, could sense nothing amiss in his former Padawan's demeanor during their occasional, increasingly rare encounters. As his training progressed, Dooku's public movement began to acquire the institutional weight of an actual government in waiting. He worked closely with powerful corporate entities who shared his frustration with Republic taxation and regulation. Organizations that possessed vast fleets, private armies, and financial resources far exceeding what most individual star systems could muster on their own. These alliances were not accidental. They had been carefully cultivated, in part by Dooku's own diplomatic skill, and in part by the unseen hand of his master, who had spent decades positioning sympathetic figures throughout galactic commerce and industry precisely for a moment like this one. Trade conglomerates that had long resented Republic oversight found in Dooku a leader who spoke their language of grievance fluently, who could frame corporate self-interest and systemic injustice as two sides of the very same coin. Banking cartels weary of Republic financial regulation, shipping guilds furious at taxation on interstellar trade lanes, manufacturing combines eager to escape labor protections imposed from Coruscant, all of them found in Dooku's growing movement a convenient political vehicle for ambitions that had little to do with the genuine grievances of the outer systems he claimed to represent. Dooku, ever the pragmatist even in his fall, understood perfectly well that many of these new allies cared nothing for the suffering he had documented on his tour of neglected worlds. He aligned with them regardless, telling himself that their resources were simply a means to an end, that once the Republic had been dismantled and rebuilt along more just lines, such opportunists could be dealt with in due course. It was the same rationalization, dressed in slightly different language, that corrupt officials across the galaxy had used for generations to justify compromises they knew, somewhere beneath the surface, they should never have made. Piece by piece, system by system, alliance by alliance, the scattered discontent Dooku had spent years cataloging across the galaxy began to consolidate into something with the shape and infrastructure of an actual rival government, one that would soon declare itself formally as the Confederacy of Independent Systems, a name chosen deliberately to evoke legitimacy rather than rebellion. To the wider public, Count Dooku remained, for the time being, simply a disillusioned former Jedi turned political reformer, a nobleman lending his considerable prestige to the cause of galactic decentralization. Behind that carefully maintained image, Darth Tyrannus was already beginning to lay the groundwork for a conflict of staggering scale, one that would eventually be known across the galaxy as the Clone Wars. He continued to visit his old friend's unfinished project in secret as well, quietly assuming stewardship over the clone army Sifo Dyas had commissioned before his disappearance, an act that allowed Dooku to ensure the Republic's future military would carry hidden vulnerabilities his master could exploit at precisely the right moment. It was, in a grim sense, the final betrayal of his friendship with Sifo Dyas, taking a project born from genuine, if reckless, concern for the galaxy's safety, and quietly repurposing it into an instrument of the very war it had been meant to prevent. Few decisions in Dooku's long fall illustrate more clearly how completely his original convictions had been hollowed out and refilled with something else entirely. Something that wore the same face, spoke with the same voice, and yet served purposes his younger self would scarcely have recognized. Across the galaxy, sympathetic worlds continued to align themselves with Dooku's growing coalition. Drawn by his eloquence, his evident sincerity, and the simple, undeniable fact that the grievances he described matched their own lived experience under a distant and unresponsive Senate. None of them could have known that the movement they were joining was no longer, if it had ever truly been, a genuine effort at reform. It had become instead the opening act of a war engineered from the shadows, one designed not to fix the Republic's failures, but to exploit them, to burn the entire structure down so that something else, something far darker, could rise from the wreckage in its place. Dooku stood at the center of that gathering storm, still believing, or perhaps simply needing to believe, that he remained its author rather than merely its most convincing instrument. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of being underestimated by those who saw only his composed exterior. And now, cloaked in a Sith identity almost no one suspected, he prepared to turn that lifelong talent toward the complete unraveling of the Republic he had once sworn to protect. The tragedy of Count Dooku is not that he was simply seduced by promises of power, though power certainly played its part. It is that every step of his fall was paved with grievances that were, at least in part, entirely legitimate, transformed by patient manipulation into justification for atrocities he could never have imagined committing as the earnest young Padawan who once trained under Grand Master Yoda's watchful eye. The war that Darth Tyrannus had spent years quietly engineering finally erupted on a dusty, insect-ridden world at the edge of the Outer Rim, a planet called Geonosis, where Dooku had gathered the leadership of his newly formed confederacy to finalize preparations for open conflict with the Republic. He had not expected to be discovered so directly, nor so soon. Geonosis itself was an unforgiving world, its surface a maze of towering rust-colored spires built by the insectoid species that called the planet home, its skies thick with the industrial haze of foundries that had, for years, quietly produced the droid armies. Dooku's confederacy would soon unleash across the galaxy. Dooku had chosen the planet carefully as a meeting point specifically because of its isolation, its inhospitable terrain, and the near-total loyalty of its native population to the wealthy off-world interests who had long ago struck lucrative manufacturing agreements with the Geonosian hives. It was meant to be the quiet, final assembly of a war machine that had been years in the making. A gathering where the Trade Federation, the Techno-Union, the Banking Clan, and the other corporate powers who had aligned themselves with Dooku's cause could finalize the logistics of a conflict none of them yet realized was designed, from its very inception, to serve purposes far beyond their own commercial interests. A Jedi Knight investigating the assassination attempt on a senator had traced a chain of evidence first to a secret cloning facility, then to Geonosis itself, arriving in time to witness Dooku meeting openly with separatist leaders and the droid manufacturing magnates who would supply his coming war. When that Jedi and his companions were captured and sentenced to a public execution for the amusement of the Geonosian population, Dooku found himself facing a problem he had not fully anticipated. A rescue attempt, mounted not by a handful of Jedi, but by an entire strike team, followed almost immediately by the arrival of an army the Republic itself did not yet know it possessed. What followed in the arena and the surrounding battlefield was one of the largest and most consequential confrontations the galaxy had witnessed in 1,000 years. Jedi Knights and Masters working alongside newly deployed clone troopers, fought their way through waves of battle droids in a chaotic, sprawling engagement that would come to be remembered as the opening battle of the Clone Wars. Amid the chaos, Dooku found himself face to face with two Jedi he knew intimately well. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had trained under his own former apprentice, and Anakin Skywalker, the prodigiously gifted young Padawan whose reputation had already begun to precede him across the Jedi Order. The duel that followed revealed, in miniature, everything that made Dooku such a dangerous opponent. His refined, economical style of swordplay made short work of both Jedi in tandem, wounding Obi-Wan and severing Anakin's arm at the elbow with a precision that unsettled onlookers even amid a battlefield already soaked in violence. It was not rage that drove Dooku's blade in that moment. It was control, the very quality his training under Yoda had once cultivated for entirely different purposes, now turned toward maiming rather than protecting. Before Dooku could finish either wounded Jedi, Grand Master Yoda himself arrived on the scene. And for the first time since his fall, Dooku found himself facing the Master who had shaped nearly everything about who he had once been. Their duel was brief but extraordinary. A clash between two masters of the Force whose skills so thoroughly outpaced everyone else on the battlefield that soldiers on both sides paused, however briefly, to witness it. Yoda's mastery of the Force allowed him to match Dooku's blade work move for move, and for a moment it seemed the confrontation between master and fallen apprentice might end the war before it had truly begun. Dooku, recognizing that he could not overcome Yoda through swordsmanship alone, resorted to a tactic that would have been unthinkable for the Jedi Master he once was. He brought down a massive pillar toward the trapped and wounded Kenobi and Skywalker, forcing Yoda to choose between pressing his advantage in the duel or saving the lives of two Jedi who could not save themselves. Yoda chose, as Dooku had calculated he would, to catch the falling debris rather than continue the fight. And, in the moment of that hesitation, Dooku fled the battlefield entirely, escaping to report to his true master on Coruscant. The Battle of Geonosis ended in a technical Republic victory, but the cost had been devastating, with a significant portion of the assembled Jedi strike force killed in the fighting, a loss the Order would feel for the remainder of the war. For Dooku, the battle's true significance lay not in its immediate outcome, but in what it confirmed about the shape of the conflict to come. He had proven decisively that he could stand against the Jedi Order's finest and walk away, that his years of secret training had transformed him into something the Order was not fully prepared to counter. He returned to his master with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to serve as the public face and military architect of a war that would stretch across the galaxy for years, testing the Republic's institutions, the Jedi Order's resolve, and Dooku's own increasingly fragile sense of what, if anything, he still believed he was fighting for. As the Clone Wars unfolded across countless worlds, Dooku settled into the role his master had always intended for him. Part military commander, part political figurehead, part expendable instrument whose failures could always be quietly absorbed without threatening the deeper scheme unfolding behind him. He commanded vast droid armies through subordinate generals, most notably a fearsome cyborg military leader whose ruthless efficiency on the battlefield made him one of the Republic's most feared adversaries. Dooku himself, however, remained more interested in the more intimate arts of subterfuge and political manipulation than in the grinding logistics of droid warfare, and he continued to take a direct personal hand in operations he believed could shape the war's outcome more decisively than any single battle. He orchestrated assassination attempts against senators who threatened to unite the Republic's fractured political factions. He engineered economic crises designed to bleed core worlds of the resources needed to sustain a prolonged conflict. He also cultivated, quietly and patiently, a network of sympathetic voices within the Republic's own media apparatus, journalists and commentators who, whether through genuine ideological alignment or simple financial incentive, could be relied upon to frame separatist grievances sympathetically while casting doubt on the Republic's own conduct of the war. It was a subtler weapon than any droid army, one that worked slowly over months and years rather than in the immediate aftermath of a single battle, eroding public confidence in Republic leadership through a steady accumulation of doubt rather than any single decisive revelation. Dooku understood, perhaps better than almost anyone else involved in the war's grand strategy, that wars were rarely won purely through military conquest, that the far more durable victories were won in the slow, patient reshaping of what ordinary citizens across 1,000 worlds believed to be true about the conflict consuming their lives. It was a skill he had once used in service of genuine diplomacy, coaxing warring factions toward understanding through careful, honest framing of complicated truths. He now turned that same skill toward the opposite purpose, manufacturing doubt rather than dispelling it. And he did so with an effectiveness that would have unsettled the idealistic young Padawan he had once been, had that young man ever been permitted to witness what his considerable gifts would eventually be used to accomplish. There is something almost unbearably sad in that particular image. A boy trained from infancy to seek truth and serve justice, grown into a man whose sharpest talents had been repurposed, so gradually he barely noticed the shift himself into instruments for obscuring truth and delaying the very justice he had once sworn every day of his life to protect. He negotiated, when it suited his master's purposes, with Republic officials willing to entertain the idea of a peace that Dooku had no genuine intention of ever honoring. Among the more elaborate of these schemes was a prolonged campaign targeting a coalition of senators who had begun quietly organizing behind the scenes to push for a negotiated end to the war, moderates from both core and outer rim worlds who recognized that continued fighting served neither side's genuine interests, only the interests of whoever profited from its continuation. Dooku, through intermediaries who never revealed his direct involvement, worked to undermine this coalition at every turn, leaking manufactured evidence of separatist atrocities timed precisely to derail promising negotiations, funding rival political movements designed to fracture the coalition's fragile unity, and on at least one occasion arranging the quiet disappearance of a senator whose organizing skills had made her particularly effective at building consensus across factional lines. It was work that required none of the drama of open battle, and Dooku found, to his own quiet discomfort, that he was disturbingly skilled at it, that the same intellect which had once made him a peerless Jedi diplomat now served with equal fluency the opposite purpose entirely, prolonging a war rather than ending one. He told himself, in the rare moments he allowed himself to reflect on such work at all, that a swift peace negotiated on the Republic's terms would simply preserve the very corruption he had originally set out to dismantle, that the suffering such sabotage prolonged was, however regrettable, a necessary cost of the deeper transformation still to come. It was a rationalization built on the same architecture as every other justification he had constructed for himself since his fall began, plausible enough to survive scrutiny in the moment, hollow enough to crumble the instant anyone examined it too closely. It was during these years that Dooku took on a new apprentice of his own, a formidable dark side warrior named Asajj Ventress, whose ferocity in battle and hunger for power reminded Dooku, in unsettling ways, of the very traits he himself had once tried and failed to fully suppress within Komari Vosa decades earlier. Ventress served Dooku loyally through countless engagements, hunting Jedi across the war's many fronts with a single-minded intensity that made her one of the conflict's most feared assassins. Yet, the relationship between master and apprentice remained, from its very beginning, deeply asymmetrical and ultimately expendable, in exactly the way Dooku's own relationship with Sidious had always been. When his hidden master grew concerned that Ventress's growing power and public notoriety might eventually rival Dooku's own usefulness, he ordered his apprentice to eliminate her, a command Dooku carried out, or attempted to carry out, with the same cold pragmatism that had come to define nearly every choice he made since abandoning the Jedi Order. That Ventress survived the attempt, against every expectation, said as much about her own formidable resilience as it did about the ruthless logic now governing Dooku's every relationship, a logic in which even loyalty offered no guarantee of safety. Before that betrayal, however, Ventress had served as one of Dooku's most effective instruments across the war's early years, dispatched to eliminate Jedi commanders on multiple fronts, to sabotage Republic supply lines, and to test the resolve of Jedi Knights whose skill Dooku wished to measure before committing his own resources against them directly. She hunted with a single-minded ferocity that Dooku found both useful and, in quieter moments, faintly troubling. A reminder of a version of dark side power he himself had never fully embraced, one driven by raw hatred, rather than the disciplined control he still privately valued above almost everything else. Dooku trained her rigorously, teaching her forms of combat and force technique, with the same exacting standards he had once brought to his Jedi apprentices, and for a time, something almost resembling genuine mentorship passed between them. However thoroughly corrupted by the circumstances of their shared allegiance, when his master's order to eliminate her arrived, Dooku carried it out with characteristic efficiency, dispatching bounty hunters to finish what direct confrontation had failed to accomplish. And he did so, by every outward account, without hesitation or visible regret. Whatever affection or respect had grown between master and apprentice over their years together was, in the end, no match for the absolute obedience Dooku had long ago decided he owed his own hidden master, an obedience that would, in time, be repaid with precisely the same casual disposability. Throughout the war, Dooku's public identity as Count of Sereno continued to serve his master's purposes, even as his secret identity as Darth Tyrannus orchestrated horrors, far removed from the noble reformer image he had first cultivated. He appeared before separatist assemblies with the same composed eloquence that had once made him one of the Jedi Order's most respected diplomats, framing battlefield defeats as strategic repositioning, framing the mounting suffering of separatist worlds as a necessary sacrifice on the road to a fairer galaxy. Many of the senators and planetary leaders who had joined his movement in its earliest days, drawn by genuinely legitimate grievances against Republic corruption, found themselves trapped in a war whose true purpose they never fully understood, following a leader whose sincerity they had trusted and who had, in fact, never stopped believing at least some of what he told them, even as he served an agenda that had almost nothing to do with their welfare. This was, perhaps, the cruelest dimension of Dooku's fall. Not that he lied to those who followed him, but that he had convinced himself so thoroughly of his own righteousness that the lies felt, to him, indistinguishable from truth. Dooku's path crossed repeatedly with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker throughout the war's long years, each encounter deepening the personal, almost familial animosity between the fallen Jedi Master and the students of his own former apprentice. On more than one occasion, Dooku found himself close enough to ending the war decisively by eliminating one or both of the Jedi who had become the Republic's most celebrated heroes, only to be thwarted by timing, by intervention, or by his own master's insistence that certain confrontations be permitted to continue unresolved, their true purpose hidden even from Dooku himself. He did not know, through most of the war, that his own eventual death had already been folded into his master's calculations, that his usefulness was always understood by the one man he had trusted above all others to be temporary. Dooku, who had spent his entire life as a Jedi, cultivating the ability to see through deception in others, remained remarkably unable, or perhaps unwilling, to recognize the deception unfolding within his own life, a blindness that would ultimately cost him everything. One of the more revealing episodes of Dooku's dual existence took place early in the war, when Obi-Wan Kenobi found himself captured aboard Dooku's own flagship during a mission that had originally been intended to eliminate the Confederacy's leadership in a single decisive strike. The mission had begun as a straightforward reconnaissance operation. Kenobi tracking a separatist fleet gathering near a contested outer rim system, only to find himself outmaneuvered and captured after his own forces were drawn into a trap that had, in hindsight, been prepared with unusual precision. Brought before Dooku in a private chamber aboard the flagship, restrained but otherwise treated with a courtesy that surprised him, Kenobi expected interrogation, perhaps torture, certainly not the strange, almost wistful conversation that instead unfolded. Rather than executing his captive immediately, Dooku chose instead to speak with him, extending an invitation that revealed just how much of his old Jedi identity still lingered beneath the Sith Lord's composed exterior. He offered Kenobi refreshment, inquired after the health of Jedi Masters they had both once known, and spoke of the Order's current leadership with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness that seemed, in the moment, almost involuntary. Only gradually did the conversation turn toward its true purpose. He told Kenobi, with what appeared to be genuine conviction, that the Republic itself had fallen under the control of a Sith Lord, that the war engulfing the galaxy was not a fight between good and evil, but a fight between two factions, both ultimately serving the same hidden master, and that the only path to true justice lay in Kenobi abandoning his loyalty to a corrupted Senate and joining Dooku's cause instead. It was, in almost every particular, the truth, delivered by the one man in the galaxy positioned to know it with absolute certainty. And yet Kenobi, understandably, dismissed it as separatist propaganda, a manipulation designed to sow doubt rather than a genuine warning, and the moment passed without consequence, one of several instances throughout the war where Dooku seemed to gesture toward the truth of his master's scheme without ever fully committing to exposing it. The reasons behind Dooku's strange half-honesty in these moments remain a subject of considerable debate among those who have studied his final years. Some believe he was testing Kenobi, probing for weaknesses he could exploit later. Others believe something more complicated was occurring beneath the surface, that some remnant of the Jedi Master he had once been continued to resist full complicity in his master's grand design, manifesting as these strange, half-hearted attempts to warn his enemies of a truth he could not bring himself to fully embrace or fully reject. Whatever the explanation, these moments of apparent candor never altered the course of the war in any meaningful way, and Dooku continued to serve his master's purposes with the same outward loyalty, even as private doubts, whatever their true depth, continued to gnaw quietly beneath his composed exterior. There is also a colder, more calculating explanation that some historians favor, one that requires no lingering fragment of conscience at all. By revealing a version of the truth that no reasonable Jedi could act upon without proof, framed always as separatist rhetoric rather than sincere warning, Dooku may simply have been indulging a private cruelty, savoring the knowledge that he alone understood the true shape of the war, while those around him, friend and enemy alike, remained blind to it. Such a reading casts these conversations not as evidence of buried conscience, but as a subtler, more intellectual form of villainy. A man who had come to enjoy his own singular vantage point over a galaxy he had once served honestly, and now regarded, in some private corner of himself, with something close to contempt. The two explanations are not, in truth, mutually exclusive. A man capable of both genuine residual conviction and quiet, cultivated cruelty is, if anything, a more accurate portrait of exactly the kind of complicated figure Dooku had become by the middle years of the war. Someone whose inner life had grown as layered and contradictory as the political theater he performed each day for a galaxy that had no idea who he truly was. As the war ground on, Dooku found himself increasingly reliant on his cyborg general to manage the day-to-day operations of the separatist military machine, freeing Dooku himself to focus on the political theater and covert operations he found far more suited to his temperament. This general, assembled from what remained of a once proud warrior after a devastating accident, harbored his own smoldering resentment toward the Jedi Order. A resentment Dooku found useful without ever fully trusting the being who carried it. Their relationship was one of convenience rather than genuine partnership, each using the other to advance separate ambitions that happened, for a time, to align. Dooku viewed his general as a useful tool, brutally effective but lacking any of the philosophical sophistication Dooku still privately believed distinguished his own path from common villainy. The general, for his part, chafed under Dooku's aristocratic condescension, though he lacked the standing within the Confederacy's power structure to challenge it directly. There was, on more than one occasion, open friction between the two commanders, disagreements that revealed just how little genuine respect passed between them despite their outward alliance. During one particularly costly engagement, Dooku's general withdrew his forces from a battle that appeared, by every reasonable military assessment, still winnable, retreating rather than risking his own survival in a conflict he judged too dangerous to continue. Dooku, informed of the retreat afterward, made no effort to hide his contempt, remarking coldly to his subordinates that a commander who valued his own preservation above the success of his mission was scarcely worth the considerable resources that had gone into rebuilding him. It was a criticism dripping with irony from a man who had, by that point, spent years serving a master whose entire strategy depended on precisely the kind of self-interested calculation Dooku now condemned in his own subordinate, though whether Dooku himself ever recognized that irony remains, like so much about his final years, a matter of speculation rather than certainty. The general, for his part, learned to conduct his more cautious maneuvers away from Dooku's direct observation whenever possible, a small but telling illustration of just how thoroughly mutual distrust had come to define even the highest levels of the Confederacy's supposed unity. The war produced countless battles across the galaxy, on worlds whose names would come to be remembered for the staggering losses suffered there. Contested space stations, ravaged capital cities, entire star systems reduced to blockade and siege. Dooku appeared personally at several of the war's most pivotal confrontations, wielding both his lightsaber and his considerable command authority to shape outcomes that too often left both sides bloodied without meaningfully advancing anyone's stated cause. He grew, over the course of these years, increasingly weary in a manner that few around him would have recognized as anything other than the natural fatigue of prolonged warfare. One siege, in particular, waged against a shipbuilding world whose orbital foundries the Confederacy desperately needed to sustain its dwindling droid production, illustrated the growing toll the war had taken on Dooku's own sense of purpose. The planet's defenders, a coalition of local militia and a small contingent of Republic clone troopers, held out for weeks against overwhelming separatist numbers, refusing to surrender even as their supplies dwindled and their casualties mounted into the thousands. Dooku, overseeing the siege personally, found himself increasingly frustrated not by the defenders' resistance, but by his own general's insistence on a strategy of attrition designed to grind the planet into submission regardless of civilian cost. He argued, in private counsel with his subordinate commanders, for a more surgical approach targeting only military infrastructure, an argument he justified as simple efficiency, but which carried unmistakable echoes of the Jedi principles he claimed to have abandoned entirely. His objections were ultimately overruled by the logistics of a war that had long since outgrown any single commander's individual preferences, and the world fell only after its orbital shipyards, and much of its civilian population center beneath them had been reduced to rubble. Dooku toured the wreckage afterward in person, a decision none of his subordinates understood, walking silently through streets that had, weeks earlier, housed families with no stake whatsoever in the ideological battle being fought over their heads. He said nothing to anyone about what he felt during that walk, and no record survives of his private thoughts. But he never again argued so forcefully against his general's tactics. A small, telling surrender that marked one more quiet erosion of whatever resistance still remained within him. In truth, it was something closer to a slow, creeping disillusionment, an echo of the very frustration that had once driven him from the Jedi Order in the first place, now directed at a war he had helped engineer, but increasingly seemed powerless to end on terms he could recognize as just. There were moments, rare but unmistakable, when something like the old Dooku resurfaced, when the Count who had once fought to prevent unnecessary suffering seemed to flicker briefly behind the eyes of the Sith Lord, who now orchestrated it on a galactic scale. He intervened on at least one occasion, to spare captured Republic soldiers from an execution his own subordinates had ordered, citing military pragmatism to those around him. While privately unable to fully articulate, even to himself, why the act of mercy had mattered so much in that particular moment, he continued to correspond, sporadically and carefully, with old acquaintances from his Jedi years, conversations that revealed a man still searching, however fruitlessly, for some thread of connection to the life and principles he had long ago claimed to have transcended entirely. None of these fragments amounted to genuine redemption, but they suggest that Dooku's fall, unlike the fall of some who embraced the dark side with unambiguous enthusiasm, remained until the very end a more complicated and more tragic transformation, a man perpetually at war with the ghost of who he used to be. Among the correspondence Dooku maintained in secret during these years was an intermittent, carefully guarded exchange of messages with a senator he had known since his final years as a Jedi Council member, a moderate voice who had once shared many of Dooku's own frustrations with Republic corruption, without ever following him into open rebellion. Their letters, sent through channels designed to obscure their true origin from both the Republic and the Confederacy alike, rarely touched directly on the war itself, focusing instead on smaller, almost mundane subjects: the fate of mutual acquaintances, philosophical questions about justice and governance that Dooku had once debated openly in the halls of the Jedi Temple. It was, in its way, the closest thing Dooku permitted himself to genuine intimacy during the war years. A small, carefully contained space where he could still speak, however guardedly, as the man he had been rather than the identity he had constructed since. Whether the senator ever suspected the true identity of her correspondent remains unknown, though some later speculated that her own growing wariness of the Chancellor's expanding wartime powers may have been shaped, in part, by fragments of insight Dooku allowed to slip into their exchanges without ever stating them outright. If so, it stands as one of the rare instances where whatever remained of Dooku's original convictions produced a genuine, if indirect, benefit for the very Republic he had spent years working to dismantle. As the war entered its final, most desperate phase, Dooku's master set in motion the last and most consequential scheme of the entire conflict, one that would require Dooku's willing, unknowing participation in his own eventual death. The plan called for a daring raid on Coruscant itself, deep in the heart of Republic territory, where Dooku's cyborg general would lead a bold assault on the Chancellor's own quarters, abducting the Republic's highest official in a spectacle designed to appear as a devastating separatist victory. In truth, the abduction was theater from its very first moment, a scenario engineered entirely by the Chancellor himself, the very man Dooku had served in secret for years without ever suspecting that the frail by-9 embattled politician he occasionally glimpsed from a distance was, in fact, his own hidden master, hiding in the most obvious place imaginable. Dooku was told only that the operation was intended to capture the Chancellor and hold him as leverage, a plausible enough objective that gave him no reason to suspect the far more elaborate purpose his master actually intended. The planning for the raid consumed weeks of careful preparation, coordinated between Dooku and his general with an attention to detail that reflected just how significant a target the Chancellor represented, at least in the version of events Dooku understood himself to be pursuing. Coruscant's defenses were formidable, layered with planetary shields, orbital patrol fleets, and rapid response squadrons that had repelled every previous attempt at direct assault on the Republic's capital throughout the war. Breaching them required exploiting a narrow window in the defense grid's rotation schedule. Information Dooku's intelligence network had acquired through channels he did not examine too closely. Channels that had, in fact, been quietly arranged by his own master to ensure the operation's success. He found it mildly curious. In retrospect, how smoothly the intelligence had come together. How conveniently the defense grid's vulnerabilities had been mapped in advance. But curiosity of that kind had become such a familiar companion throughout his years of service that he no longer thought to interrogate it as thoroughly as the old Jedi Master he had once been surely would have. The raid succeeded exactly as planned, and the Chancellor was spirited away aboard Dooku's own flagship, a massive vessel positioned in the skies above Coruscant, as the Republic's fleet scrambled to respond to an attack of unprecedented audacity. Word reached Dooku that the Republic's response would be led personally by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, the very pair whose growing legend had come to symbolize everything Dooku found simultaneously impressive and infuriating about the Jedi Order's continued resistance. He prepared for their arrival with the calm, methodical focus that had defined his entire life, unaware that he was, in truth, preparing for the final battle of his existence, one whose outcome had already been decided by a master who valued his apprentice's usefulness only so long as it served a larger design. Dooku had never been permitted to fully see. Above Coruscant, the battle raged with an intensity that dwarfed even the earlier engagements of the war. Hundreds of capital ships exchanging turbolaser fire across the planet's orbit, while swarms of starfighters wove between the wreckage of vessels already lost. Kenobi and Skywalker piloted their way through this chaos with the practiced skill of men who had spent years fighting together, weaving between defensive fire and colliding debris until they found an opening to board Dooku's flagship directly, a bold and reckless maneuver that reflected both their skill and their willingness to gamble everything on a rescue that offered no guarantee of success. Once aboard, they cut their way through corridor after corridor of battle droids, the ship's automated defenses activating in response to the intrusion, forcing the two Jedi into a running battle that tested even their considerable combined skill. The two Jedi fought their way through the flagship with the same combination of skill, improvisation, and reckless determination that had made them legends across the galaxy, cutting down droid after droid as they pushed toward the ship's command deck. When they finally located the captured Chancellor, secured in an observation chamber overlooking the burning wreckage of the battle raging outside, they found Dooku waiting for them as well, calm, composed, and entirely unsurprised by their arrival. What followed was the culmination of years of history between these three men, a duel shaped as much by old wounds and unresolved grievances as by pure swordsmanship. Dooku used the Force to incapacitate Kenobi early in the confrontation, a tactical decision that left the more volatile and less disciplined Skywalker to face him alone, precisely the outcome Dooku's master had always intended, though Dooku himself understood it only as a sound military choice rather than the deliberate manipulation it truly was. Anakin fought with an intensity that startled even Dooku, drawing on reserves of anger that had been building within him for years. Anger sharpened further by the sight of his wounded former master lying helpless nearby. Dooku, who had spent decades cultivating a fighting style built around patience and control, found himself increasingly unable to match the sheer ferocity of his young opponent's assault. It was, in its way, a mirror of Dooku's own long-ago duel with Yoda. Except that where Yoda had matched Dooku's technical mastery blow for blow, Anakin simply overwhelmed it entirely. His raw power and unchecked emotion burning through defenses that had once seemed impenetrable to opponents far more experienced than he was. In a matter of moments, Dooku's hands, the hands that had wielded a lightsaber with unmatched precision since he was barely old enough to walk, were severed at the wrists, leaving him disarmed and kneeling before the very chancellor he had unknowingly served for years. What happened next would come to be remembered as one of the most consequential moments of the entire war, though its true significance would not become clear until much later. The Chancellor, still bound to his chair, urged Anakin to finish what he had started, to kill the disarmed and defenseless Sith Lord kneeling before him. Anakin hesitated, some remaining fragment of Jedi conviction reminding him that executing a helpless prisoner violated everything the Order had taught him to value. But the Chancellor pressed further, and Anakin, driven by a combination of rage, exhaustion, and a desire to please the man he had come to trust and admire above almost anyone else in his life, complied. Dooku's final expression, in the last instant before Anakin's blade fell, was not fear. Those who study the moment closely have long debated what exactly it was. Some describe it as resignation. Others describe something closer to relief, as though some part of Dooku had understood, in that final second, that death offered an escape from a life that had long ago stopped belonging to him in any meaningful sense. Dooku died believing, to whatever extent he still believed anything with genuine conviction, that his death served the Confederacy's cause, that his sacrifice, however unwelcome, would advance the larger struggle he had spent years telling himself was just. He never learned the truth his own death actually served, that his usefulness to his master had simply run its course, that the same manipulative genius which had recruited him decades earlier as a disillusioned Jedi master had orchestrated his execution with the same cold precision, using his own protégé's rage as the instrument. Dooku, the Count who had once questioned everything about the institutions he served, died without ever fully questioning the one relationship that had defined the final chapter of his life, a blindness that stands as perhaps the most bitterly ironic detail in the entire tragedy of his fall. In the moments immediately following the killing blow, Anakin stood frozen over the body of the man he had just executed, the full weight of what he had done settling over him, even as the ship around them continued to shudder from ongoing battle damage. There was no time for reflection. The flagship, badly wounded by the fighting both outside and within its corridors, had begun losing altitude, its systems failing one by one as it descended toward the planet below. Freeing the still-bound Chancellor and rousing the recovering Kenobi, Anakin fought to stabilize what remained of the ship's controls, while explosions rippled through decks above and below them, a desperate scramble for survival that left little room to process the significance of what had just occurred in that quiet observation chamber. Only later, once the three of them had crash-landed the burning wreckage onto a Coruscant landing platform, and the immediate adrenaline of survival had faded, would the full weight of the execution begin to settle over Anakin in earnest, a quiet, gnawing unease that he would carry, largely unspoken, through the remaining months of his own tragic transformation. He had crossed a line he did not yet fully understand, guided there by the very man whose gratitude and approval he had, by that point, come to value above almost anything else in his life, including, though he could not yet see it, the values the Jedi Order had spent years teaching him to uphold. News of Dooku's death reached Grand Master Yoda within hours, relayed through the official channels that tracked such pivotal developments across the war's many fronts. Those present in the Jedi Council chamber, when the report arrived, would later describe a stillness that settled over the ancient master, a silence far heavier than the news of any single battlefield casualty might normally warrant, however significant. Yoda had trained Dooku from infancy, had shaped the earliest understanding of the Force in a mind that would go on to become one of the most formidable duelists the galaxy had ever produced, before that same mind turned itself deliberately and irrevocably toward darkness. Whatever grief Yoda allowed himself in that moment, he kept largely private, offering only measured words to his fellow council members about the tragedy of a life so thoroughly wasted, about the enduring danger of pride left unchecked by humility. Later, in the quiet of his own private meditation, Yoda would reflect at length on where his own teaching might have failed his former apprentice, whether some different approach, some different words spoken at some different crossroads decades earlier, might have altered the course of a life that instead ended in an anonymous execution aboard a burning warship. He would never arrive at a satisfying answer, a rare and uncomfortable admission for a master otherwise so certain in his wisdom, and the question of what, if anything, could have saved Dooku from himself would linger with Yoda for the remainder of his own long life. Across the Confederacy, news of Dooku's death spread with a speed that revealed just how central he had become to the entire separatist enterprise, despite years of careful theater suggesting a broader, more distributed leadership. Corporate delegates who had aligned themselves with his movement scrambled to determine what his absence meant for their own considerable investments in the war, while sympathetic senators and planetary leaders who had genuinely believed in the reforms he claimed to champion found themselves suddenly leaderless, their movement's public face and moral justification removed in a single stroke. Few of them yet understood that this removal had been entirely intentional, that Dooku's death cleared the final obstacle standing between the war's architect and the consolidation of absolute power he had spent decades quietly engineering. Within a remarkably short span of time following Dooku's death, the war itself would reach its own catastrophic conclusion. The very clone army Dooku had once helped commission from his old friend's unfinished project turning without warning against the Jedi Order. It had fought alongside for years, a betrayal built into the very foundations of the army from its earliest secret days on a distant ocean world. The war Dooku had helped ignite consumed, in the end, nearly everything he had once claimed to be fighting to protect. The Jedi Order he had abandoned, the Republic he had claimed to be reforming, and ultimately his own life, discarded the moment it had served its final purpose. In the years since his death, historians and philosophers across the galaxy have continued to debate what exactly Count Dooku's story represents, whether he should be remembered primarily as a villain, a victim, or something more complicated that resists such simple categorization entirely. Unlike many who fall to the dark side, Dooku's path was never driven primarily by personal ambition or lust for power in any straightforward sense. He had already possessed wealth, status, and the respect of his peers before he ever encountered his master's manipulation. What he lacked, and what his master offered with such devastating precision, was validation. The sense that his grievances against a corrupt and complacent galaxy were not merely the frustrations of an impatient man, but genuine, righteous insight that entitled him to act decisively where others had only offered patience and procedure. One theory that has gained considerable traction among those who study Dooku's fall suggests that he came to believe, in the years following his departure from the Jedi Order, that he himself might be the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy the Jedi had long debated. A foretold figure destined to restore balance to the Force. If Dooku genuinely held this conviction, even privately, it would help explain the particular character of his fall, less a story of simple corruption than a tragedy of profound self-belief twisted toward catastrophic ends. Where Anakin Skywalker's own entanglement with this same prophecy stemmed from fear and personal loss, Dooku's version, if the theory holds true, would have been rooted in something closer to intellectual and moral certainty, a conviction that he alone possessed the clarity and the will to do what the Jedi Order's collective caution could never accomplish. It transforms his alliance with a hidden Sith Master from a simple story of seduction into something more unsettling, a man who believed he was using his master's power for his own righteous purposes, even as he was, in fact, being used entirely in return. The parallels and contrasts between Dooku's fall and the fall of the very man who killed him have long fascinated those who study this era of galactic history. Both men were exceptionally gifted. Both were shaped in different ways by loss, disillusionment, and a growing conviction that the Jedi Order's patient wisdom had become inadequate to the crises they perceived gathering around them. Both were manipulated, patiently and expertly, by the same hidden Sith Lord, who tailored his approach to each man's particular wound with unsettling precision, offering Dooku validation for grievances built on decades of accumulated frustration, offering Anakin the promise of power sufficient to prevent the kind of loss that had already devastated him once and threatened, in his visions, to devastate him again. Yet where Anakin's fall was sudden, propelled by acute terror and desperate love, Dooku's was slow, almost geological in its pace, a gradual erosion of conviction stretched across decades, rather than compressed into a single desperate choice. Perhaps this explains why history remembers the two men so differently, why Anakin's story is so often framed as tragedy, while Dooku's is more frequently framed as villainy, despite the two men sharing a manipulator, a war, and ultimately a death delivered by each other's hands in the very same chamber. Time itself, it seems, shapes how a fall is remembered nearly as much as the fall's underlying causes. Rewarding sudden catastrophe with sympathy, that patient, considered corruption, rarely receives in equal measure. Perhaps that asymmetry says as much about the nature of storytelling itself as it does about the two men whose intertwined tragedies it describes. A reminder that the slow erosion of conviction rarely produces the dramatic, legible arc audiences instinctively reach for, even when its human cost proves every bit as devastating in the end. This reading of Dooku's character finds support in the particular way he carried himself even after fully embracing the identity of Darth Tyrannus. Unlike Sith Lords driven primarily by rage or hatred, Dooku retained, until the very end, an almost unsettling calm, a refined and deliberate manner that seemed to reflect genuine belief in a more disciplined, more balanced approach to power. His mastery of a lightsaber form built around control and precision rather than raw aggression suggests a man who saw himself as fundamentally different from the impulsive villains that populate so much of galactic history. A duelist who believed that measured, decisive action, however ruthless, represented a higher form of wisdom than the passive patience he had spent his entire Jedi life being taught to value. This same philosophy extended into the way he trained those who briefly served beneath him during the war, an insistence on discipline and restraint that stood in visible contrast to the chaotic brutality favored by many of his separatist allies. He spoke often, in the rare unguarded moments his subordinates witnessed, of a coming balance he claimed the galaxy desperately needed, a vision that remained frustratingly vague whenever pressed for specifics, as though even Dooku himself could not fully articulate what such balance would actually look like once achieved. Only that he alone possessed the clarity to recognize it when it finally arrived. If he did believe himself the chosen one, his death at Anakin Skywalker's hands takes on an additional layer of tragic irony. Struck down, not merely by an enemy combatant, but, symbolically, by the very figure the prophecy may have actually pointed toward all along, a passing of a mantle Dooku never knew he had been carrying falsely. Other historians take a more skeptical view of this theory, arguing that Dooku's fall requires no grand prophetic framework to be understood, that the simpler and more universally applicable explanation, a brilliant, prideful man, exploited by a patient and superior manipulator, captures the essential tragedy just as completely. Without requiring speculation about beliefs, Dooku never stated openly to anyone who survived to record them. Whichever interpretation one favors, the broader shape of Dooku's story remains remarkably consistent across every telling. He began as a nobleman, given away by his own family. He became one of the most gifted Jedi of his generation, trained by its wisest living master, mentor to knights who would themselves shape galactic history. He grew disillusioned, not without cause, with the institutions he had spent his entire life serving, and in that disillusionment, patiently and expertly exploited by a Sith Lord who had spent decades preparing precisely such a trap, he became the instrument of the very corruption and suffering he had once dedicated himself to opposing. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches itself to stories like Dooku's, different from the grief owed to purely tragic victims or purely irredeemable villains. It is the grief of watching genuine talent, genuine intellect, and even genuine moral conviction bend slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they serve purposes their original bearer would once have found unrecognizable. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what Dooku might have accomplished had his considerable gifts remained anchored to the principles that first defined his Jedi training. He possessed an intellect capable of reshaping galactic diplomacy, a physical mastery few duelists in recorded history could match, and, for a significant portion of his life, a genuine, demonstrated commitment to justice that manifested in mercy, shown to defeated enemies, in mediated peace that held for generations, in the patient mentorship of students who went on to shape galactic events in their own right. That such a person could be so thoroughly redirected toward mass suffering stands as one of the most sobering illustrations the Star Wars galaxy offers of how fragile even the most rigorously cultivated virtue can prove to be when subjected to sufficiently patient and sufficiently personalized manipulation. It suggests that no amount of training, no depth of wisdom, no accumulated decades of discipline can fully immunize a person against corruption, so long as that corruption arrives, disguised as validation for grievances that were, in their origin, entirely legitimate. On Sereno, in the years following his death, the noble house Dooku had reclaimed as a disillusioned former Jedi passed to distant relations who had watched his transformation from Jedi Master to separatist leader with a mixture of pride, confusion, and eventual horror as the true scope of the galaxy's suffering became clear. His sister Jenza, elderly by the war's final years, reportedly spoke of her brother rarely, and only in careful, measured terms, unwilling either to condemn the boy she barely remembered or to defend the man his choices had ultimately made him. It is a fittingly quiet end for a story that began in a similarly quiet fashion. An infant carried away from a family estate before he was old enough to remember the faces of the people who had given him up. A boy shaped almost entirely by an institution that could offer him discipline and purpose, but never quite the unconditional belonging that might have anchored him against the particular kind of manipulation that eventually found him. Whether such belonging would have been enough to change the course of everything that followed is, like so much about Dooku's story, a question without a certain answer, one more thread left permanently unresolved in the long, tangled history of a galaxy that has never stopped grappling with the fine, uncertain line between righteous conviction and the darkness that so often waits patiently just beyond it, ready to offer validation to anyone tired enough, or hurt enough, or proud enough to accept it. Dooku never stopped believing, on some level, that he was fighting for justice. That belief simply became, over the course of decades, a tool wielded by someone else entirely. A lesson the wider galaxy would do well to remember whenever charisma, conviction, and genuine grievance align a little too perfectly with the ambitions of those working quietly behind the scenes. Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, nobleman, Jedi Master, revolutionary, Sith Lord, remains one of the Star Wars galaxy's most haunting reminders that the road to becoming an instrument of tremendous harm rarely begins with a villain twirling a blade in the dark. More often, it begins with a good question asked by a good man that no one around him was willing or able to answer honestly before it was too late.